Just because of one sunflower, I almost ended up in court, and she called 911 3 times in one afternoon. She dressed in business clothes but never went to work, and thought she was FBI just because she worked for the HOA board. This wasn't the first time a neighbor knocked on my door, but it was the first time things got complicated. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to deal with an HOA Karen like this one. Trust me, this story gets wild, and I guarantee you haven't heard anything like what happened next. It was 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, and I was deep in code when my doorbell started ringing like someone was playing a Mozart symphony on it. I'm Eli Harper, a software engineer who works remotely, and I'd moved to Maple Grove HOA about 6 months earlier with my wife Monica. She was working her day shift as a 911 dispatcher, so I was flying solo when this whole mess started. The house was quiet except for the hum of my computer and the persistent ding-dong-dong that was quickly becoming the soundtrack to my personal nightmare. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with Madison Fletcher. Though I didn't know her name yet, I just knew her as that woman who always carries a clipboard and stares at everyone's lawns like she's conducting a military inspection. Madison stood there in a wrinkled blazer that looked like she'd slept in it, holding what appeared to be the most official-looking piece of paper I'd ever seen outside of a government building. It was laminated, color-coded, and had more fonts than a ransom note. The woman herself was maybe 29, with that particular brand of suburban confidence that comes from having absolutely nothing to do except monitor other people's business. Her hair was styled in what I can only describe as aggressive professional, like she was trying to intimidate her own reflection. "Mr. Harper," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Madison Fletcher, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association Board. I need to conduct an immediate inspection of your property regarding violations of our community standards." She waved that laminated paper like it was a warrant signed by the Supreme Court. I blinked at her, still holding my coffee mug and wondering if I'd accidentally time-traveled to some alternate reality where HOA presidents had law enforcement powers. "Violations?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What violations?" That's when she pointed dramatically at my front yard, where I'd planted 3 sunflowers along the walkway the previous weekend. They were maybe 2 feet tall, bright yellow, and about as threatening as a golden retriever puppy. "Those," she declared, with the gravity of someone announcing the discovery of weapons of mass destruction, "are not approved plantings according to Section 4.7 of our landscaping guidelines. I need to inspect your property to document this and any other potential violations." The way she said "other violations" made it sound like she expected to find a meth lab in my basement. That's when my old instincts kicked in. I'd worked for a startup a few years back where the CEO was a micromanaging nightmare who thought he could walk into anyone's office and demand to see their work at any hour. The experience had left me with a serious allergy to people who confused authority with tyranny. "I'm sorry, but no," I said, politely but firmly. "You're not coming into my house. If you have concerns about my landscaping, we can discuss them right here on the porch." Madison's face went through several interesting color changes, pink to red to purple, like a mood ring having an existential crisis. "Sir, as HOA president, I have the right to inspect any property for compliance violations. This is clearly stated in your homeowner agreement." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my sunflowers like they were evidence in a murder trial. Here's where I made the decision that probably saved my sanity and possibly my legal future. I pulled out my phone and opened voice memos, hitting record with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned the hard way that documentation is everything. "I'm recording this conversation for both our protection," I announced clearly. "Now, can you show me exactly where in the HOA agreement it says you have the right to enter my home without my permission?" Madison's eyes widened like I just pulled out a lightsaber. "You can't record me without my consent," she sputtered. "Actually, in this state, I only need one-party consent, and I'm that party," I replied. "So again, where does it say you can come into my house?" The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. For the next 10 minutes, Madison tried every manipulation tactic in the book. She went from legal threats to emotional appeals to what I can only describe as attempted guilt-tripping about community standards and property values. She claimed my sunflowers were going to single-handedly destroy the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity and probably cause a mass exodus of homeowners. According to her increasingly frantic explanation, my 3 innocent flowers were apparently the first domino in what would inevitably become the complete collapse of suburban civilization as we know it. But here's the thing about bullies. And make no mistake, that's exactly what Madison was. They don't expect resistance. They expect compliance, apologies, and immediate submission to their will. When it became clear that I wasn't going to cave, Madison's professional mask finally slipped completely. "Fine," she snapped, her voice climbing to a pitch that probably made dogs 3 streets over start howling. "You'll be hearing from me officially. This isn't over, Mr. Harper, not by a long shot." She stormed off my porch, but not before stopping directly in front of my sunflowers and taking about 20 more photos from different angles. I watched her march back to her car, a white SUV that was somehow both spotless and aggressive looking, and couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just poked a particularly vindictive bear. As she drove away, I noticed she slowed down to take even more pictures of my house from the street. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a simple neighborhood disagreement. The first shot in Madison's war arrived exactly 72 hours later, delivered with the subtlety of a brick through a window. I found it in my mailbox Tuesday afternoon, a manila envelope so thick it could have contained the complete works of Shakespeare. Inside was what appeared to be an official citation, printed on heavyweight paper, with the HOA logo embossed at the top like some kind of government seal. The document was titled, "Notice of Siclation and Assessment of Penalties," in bold red letters that screamed authority. According to this masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, I was being fined $500 for unauthorized landscaping modifications and refusal to comply with mandatory HOA inspection protocols. $500 for 3 sunflowers and the audacity of not letting a stranger into my house. What really got my attention, though, was the level of detail in this thing. Madison had included photographs, measurements, and what appeared to be a full environmental impact assessment of my sunflowers' effect on the neighborhood's visual harmony. She'd even created a chart showing how my flowers violated the approved color palette for front yard plantings. Apparently, bright yellow was too attention-seeking for our community's refined aesthetic standards. The document was signed with a flourish and dated, stamped, and notarized like it was some kind of legal judgment. This wasn't the work of someone who occasionally enforced HOA rules. This was the obsessive product of someone who lived and breathed this stuff. I decided it was time to get some local intelligence, so I walked over to Frank Dawson's house. Frank was a retired mechanic in his mid-40s who'd been living in the neighborhood since before Madison arrived. He was usually found tinkering with something in his garage, and today was no exception. He was elbow-deep in the engine of a classic Mustang when I knocked on his doorframe. "Hey, Eli," he called out without looking up. "Let me guess. You got a visit from our self-appointed neighborhood dictator?" When I showed him the citation, Frank wiped his hands on a rag and whistled low. $500 for sunflowers? Man, she's really outdoing herself this time. He gestured for me to follow him to his workbench, where he grabbed 2 cold beers from a mini-fridge. "Frank, level with me," I said, accepting the beer gratefully. "Is this normal? Can she actually fine me for this?" Frank took a long sip and shook his head. "I've lived here 12 years and I've never seen anyone get fined for planting flowers. Hell, Mrs. Patterson down the street has a whole rose garden that's way more attention-seeking than your sunflowers, and Madison's never said a word about it. The truth is, most of these rules feel like they're being made up as she goes along." He pulled out his phone and showed me the neighborhood group chat, scrolling through months of complaints about Madison's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. She did the same thing to the Johnsons last year, kept escalating violations until they finally gave up and moved away. I think that's her strategy, make people so miserable they just leave. That evening I sat down to write my formal appeal, but before I could finish it, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Mr. Harper? This is Nancy White. I'm the secretary for the HOA board." Her voice was barely above a whisper, like she was afraid someone might be listening. "I can't talk long, but I wanted you to know that you're not the first person Madison has targeted like this. She keeps a spreadsheet, an actual Excel file, tracking what she calls problem residents. Your name went on that list the day you moved in." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, the day I moved in? I hadn't even met her yet?" Nancy's voice got even quieter. "She doesn't like new people. She thinks they disrupt the established community dynamic." "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. I wish I could do more, but if she finds out I called you..." The line went dead. I suddenly remembered Nancy from the last community meeting I'd attended a few months back. She was a quiet woman in her early 50s, who always sat in the back and rarely spoke. During Madison's presentation about maintaining community standards, I'd noticed Nancy looking uncomfortable, especially when Madison had misquoted several HOA regulations to make them sound more restrictive than they actually were. At the time, I chalked it up to general awkwardness, but now I realized Nancy had been watching Madison bend the rules in real time and hadn't known how to speak up. The fact that she'd risked calling me meant things were even worse than I'd thought. The next morning brought another envelope, this one even thicker than the first. Madison had escalated my fine to $1,200 and added new violations I was pretty sure she'd invented overnight. According to this latest masterpiece, my sunflowers were now classified as aggressive vertical landscaping elements, and my refusal to allow inspection had been upgraded to obstruction of official HOA business. She had also included a timeline showing how my violations were escalating in severity and posed an increasing threat to community harmony. The document concluded with a final warning that failure to comply within 72 hours would result in additional enforcement measures and potential lien placement proceedings. I stared at that paper for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't just about sunflowers anymore. This was about someone who decided I didn't belong in her perfect little kingdom and was systematically trying to drive me out. I thought about my old job, where the CEO had used similar tactics to get rid of employees he didn't like. He'd pile on increasingly ridiculous requirements and punishments until people either quit or gave him an excuse to fire them. The pattern was identical, just with HOA violations instead of workplace infractions. Well, I hadn't backed down from that corporate bully, and I sure as hell wasn't going to back down from this suburban one. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. The second was to Frank, asking if he'd be willing to come with me to the next community meeting as a witness. Hell yes, Frank said immediately. It's about time someone stood up to Madison. Most of us have been too worried about retaliation to say anything, but if you're willing to take point on this, you've got my support. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole mess started. Hope. Madison might have escalation tactics, but she was about to learn that 2 could play that game. The community meeting was held at 3 o'clock the following Saturday afternoon in the rec center, and I could feel the tension the moment I walked through the door. About 25 neighbors were scattered throughout the folding chairs, most of them avoiding eye contact, like they were afraid of getting drafted into whatever war was brewing. Frank sat beside me in the 3rd row, solid and reassuring in his flannel shirt and work boot. Madison had transformed the front of the room into what could only be described as a command center, complete with a projector screen, a laptop, and a stack of papers that looked like they could choke a horse. She'd even brought a laser pointer, because apparently sunflower violations required multimedia presentation. When Madison called the meeting to order, she was wearing what I'd come to think of as her serious business outfit, a navy blazer that didn't quite fit right, and a look of grim determination that suggested she was about to deliver news of an impending apocalypse. Today, we need to address a serious threat to our community standards, she announced, clicking to her first slide. What appeared on screen was a photograph of my 3 sunflowers, blown up to poster size and labeled unauthorized aggregated landscaping. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. She'd used Comic Sans font for the header, and in the bottom right corner I could clearly see a watermark that read, Draft V 4.1, Do Not Share. Apparently, even Madison's power presentations were works in progress. The slideshow that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic absurdity. Madison had created charts showing the visual impact degradation my sunflowers were allegedly causing, complete with before and after photos that she'd clearly manipulated to make my flowers look like towering yellow monsters. Slide number 5 featured a header reading, Neighborhood Safety Concerns, complete with the spelling errors, and included a bullet point suggesting that sunflowers might attract undesirable wildlife to the area. She had apparently Googled sunflower problems and copy-pasted every potential issue she could find, regardless of how ridiculous it sounded in our suburban context. The presentation concluded with the demand that I remove the flowers immediately and pay the accumulated fines of $1,200. When Madison finished her theatrical performance and asked if anyone had questions, I stood up, slowly. I'd like to respond to these accusations, I said clearly, pulling out my phone. First, I have a recording of our initial conversation where you demanded entry to my home without any legal justification. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Apparently, most of the neighbors hadn't heard about Madison's home invasion attempt. Second, I've researched the actual HOA covenants, and nowhere do they prohibit sunflowers or any other native flowering plants. I held up a printed copy of the real guidelines, highlighted and annotated. Third, the photographs you're showing have been digitally altered to exaggerate the size and visual impact of 3 flowers that are currently less than 2 feet tall. Madison's face went through that familiar color progression again, settling on an interesting shade of purple that clashed with her navy blazer. "Mr. Harper, you are out of order," she snapped. "This is not a trial and you don't get to cross-examine the board." But I was just getting started. Actually, according to Section 2 of the HOA bylaws, any homeowner has the right to present evidence in their defense during violation proceedings. I'd done my homework this time, and it showed. Furthermore, the fine structure you're using doesn't exist in our governing documents. The maximum penalty for landscaping violations is $50, not $500, and certainly not $1,200. The room had gone completely silent, except for the hum of the projector and the sound of Madison's increasingly rapid breathing. That's when I noticed Nancy White sitting in the back corner, looking like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Every time Madison made a statement, Nancy would glance around the room with this expression of pained embarrassment, like she was watching someone she cared about make a fool of themselves in public. During Madison's explanation of the fine structure, Nancy had actually winced visibly, and when Madison claimed the authority to conduct mandatory home inspections, Nancy had closed her eyes and shaken her head slightly. She knew Madison was making things up, but she was too intimidated or too loyal to speak up. I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the desire to correct the record warring with the fear of confrontation. Madison tried to regain control by calling for a board vote to uphold the violations, but that's when things got interesting. Of the 5 board members present, only 2 raised their hands, Madison herself and a nervous-looking man who seemed to vote reflexively whenever Madison looked at him. The other 3 sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly unwilling to support what was obviously an abuse of power. "Motion fails," announced the treasurer, an older woman named Carol, who had been watching the proceedings with the expression of someone witnessing a slow-motion car crash. "Mr. Harper, your appeal is sustained. The violations are dismissed." Madison's face went from purple to white so quickly I was genuinely concerned she might pass out. But Madison wasn't done yet. Standing up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor, she pointed directly at me with a trembling finger. "This isn't over, Mr. Harper. If you think you can come into our community and ignore our rules just because you found some technicalities, you're sadly mistaken. I will escalate this to the appropriate city authorities, and I will file formal complaints with every relevant agency until this matter is properly resolved." Her voice had climbed to a pitch that was making several people in the room visibly uncomfortable. "You may have fooled some people here today, but I see exactly what you are. A troublemaker who has no respect for community values or neighborhood harmony." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. As the meeting dissolved into awkward small talk and people began filing out, I felt a mix of victory and apprehension. I'd won this battle, but Madison's parting words had carried the unmistakable tone of someone declaring war. Frank clapped me on the shoulder as we walked toward the exit. "Well, that was something," he said with a grin. "I don't think anyone's ever called Madison out like that before. You might want to invest in a security camera, though. That woman looked like she was ready to burn your house down." Just as we reached the door, I felt someone slip a piece of paper into my hand. It was Dot Sanders, a silver-haired woman in her late 60s who'd been sitting quietly in the front row. "Call me tomorrow," she whispered. "I have information about Madison that you need to hear." Sunday afternoon found me sitting on Dot Sanders' front porch, the oldest resident in Maple Grove who had witnessed the neighborhood transform from a simple collection of houses into Madison's personal kingdom. Dot poured sweet tea with the deliberate movements of someone about to share state secrets. "That woman moved here 3 years ago, carrying more baggage than a cross-country flight," she began, settling into her chair with a knowing look. "According to what I've pieced together from various conversations, when Madison was about 8 years old, her family lived in a neighborhood where older kids would vandalize their yard and throw things at their house. The parents and HOA didn't lift a finger to help them." Dot paused, letting that sink in. She grew up feeling like nobody would protect her family, and now she's flipped the script, trying to control everyone else so she never feels powerless again. The psychology made sense in a twisted way, but it didn't excuse terrorizing neighbors over sunflowers. Before moving to Maple Grove, Madison had worked at a large real estate company downtown until they fired her for harassing clients, calling them constantly, showing up at their houses unannounced to resolve paperwork discrepancies. The pattern's been there for years, Dot explained matter-of-factly. She gets a little authority and immediately abuses it because she's terrified of being vulnerable again. The HOA presidency was perfect for her, official power over people's homes and daily lives, just like she always wished someone had wielded on her behalf when she was a kid. It was a sad story that explained Madison's behavior without excusing it, and it made her systematic targeting of new residents even more disturbing. When I got home around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Monica was in the kitchen, still wearing her dispatcher uniform from the day shift. I filled her in on my conversation with Dot, watching her expression grow increasingly serious as I described Madison's escalating pattern of harassment. When I finished, Monica stopped chopping vegetables and looked directly at me. "Eli, people who are obsessed with control can become genuinely dangerous when they feel like they're losing it," she said quietly. "Let me do some research on her background through our databases. I want to know if she's had any other legal issues we should be aware of." The fact that my wife, who dealt with unstable people professionally, was taking Madison's behavior this seriously made my stomach clench with worry. Monday morning brought the first sign that Madison was making good on her threat to escalate beyond HOA boundaries. I found a fake city compliance notice taped to my front door, printed on official-looking letterhead but obviously homemade upon closer inspection. The city logo was in the wrong font, there was no signature date, and the language was just Madison's usual rhetoric, dressed up in pseudo-legal terminology demanding removal of my non-compliant landscaping elements within 48 hours. The notice looked convincing enough to fool someone who didn't examine it closely, but Madison had made enough small errors to reveal her deception. She was literally trying to impersonate city officials to intimidate me into compliance, which crossed several legal lines I was pretty sure she didn't understand. That afternoon brought an even more brazen display of Madison's deteriorating judgment. I was working at my desk when I noticed someone methodically photographing my house from the sidewalk. Madison herself, dressed in what appeared to be her version of surveillance gear, with dark sunglasses, a baseball cap, and a jacket despite the warm weather. She was documenting every angle of my property like she was building a criminal case, and when she saw me watching from the window, she actually waved and called out, "Just updating my records, Mr. Harper." The woman had completely abandoned any pretense of normal social boundaries. I grabbed my phone and started recording her amateur detective work, which made her uncomfortable enough that she packed up and left after a few more shots of my allegedly criminal sunflowers. The harassment campaign expanded to involve city agencies when I received a call from Jim Roberts in code enforcement. "Mr. Harper, we got a complaint about possible home business violations at your address. Can you tell me about any commercial activities you might be conducting?" I explained that I was a remote software engineer, which was completely legal and required no special permits. Jim sounded apologetic. "Yeah, that's what I figured. We get these neighbor complaints sometimes from people who don't understand work-from-home regulations. I'll close this as unfounded, but someone's definitely filing reports about you." Madison was systematically trying to weaponize city services against me, filing false complaints to create the impression that I was some kind of serial violator who needed official intervention. By Wednesday, the siege mentality was taking its toll, and I was beginning to understand how previous families had been worn down enough to simply move away. But that evening, Monica came home with intelligence that changed everything. I found 3 complaints against Madison at her previous job, 2 noise complaints from her old neighborhood, and 1 police report where officers had to mediate a dispute between her and a contractor, Monica reported, pulling out a printout. But here's the really interesting part. She's called 911 17 times in the past year, mostly for non-emergency situations that should have gone through regular city services. She's what we call a frequent flyer, someone who abuses emergency services for personal disputes. That revelation hit me like a cold splash of water, because it meant Madison had a documented history of escalating normal conflicts into emergency situations, and I was apparently her latest target. The question that kept me awake that night was simple but terrifying. If Madison was willing to impersonate city officials and file false complaints to get her way over sunflowers, how far would she be willing to go when those tactics failed? Monica's research had revealed someone with a pattern of escalating behavior who'd been building toward a major confrontation for months. And I had the sinking feeling that I was about to find out exactly what Madison Fletcher looked like when she finally lost control completely. The woman who'd started this fight over 3 innocent flowers was clearly prepared to turn it into something much more dangerous, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever came next. Thursday morning started with me having to take 2 hours off work to deal with a city inspector who'd received an anonymous complaint about my illegal home business operations. The inspector, a patient man in his 50s named Dave, spent about 15 minutes confirming that my home office setup was completely legal and standard for remote workers. Whoever called this in either doesn't understand work-from-home regulations or is deliberately wasting city resources, he told me as he packed up his clipboard. I'm required to follow up on all complaints, but this was obviously frivolous. Sorry for the inconvenience. As Dave drove away, I noticed Madison's white SUV parked 3 houses down, and I was pretty sure she'd been watching the entire interaction through binoculars. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, just as I was settling back into my coding project, the doorbell began its familiar, aggressive symphony. This time, Madison looked different, more disheveled, more intense, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. Her business blazer was wrinkled, her hair was slightly messy, and there was a manic energy in her eyes that made me instinctively take a step back from the door. "Mr. Harper, we need to resolve this situation once and for all," she announced without preamble. "I'm prepared to offer you one final opportunity to comply with community standards before I'm forced to take more serious action." She was holding her clipboard like a weapon and speaking in the rapid, pressured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this speech multiple times. "Madison, I've already explained that my landscaping is completely within HOA guidelines," I replied, keeping my voice calm and measured. "The community meeting confirmed that your violations were unfounded, and I'm not going to remove perfectly legal flowers because you don't like them." That's when her facade of professional authority finally cracked completely. "You think you're so smart," she snarled, "coming into our neighborhood with your attitude and your lawyer friends, thinking you can just ignore the people who've built this community? Well, I have news for you. I have the right to inspect any property in this HOA for compliance violations, and I'm exercising that right now. Step aside." She actually tried to push past me into my house, forcing me to block the doorway with my arm. The confrontation escalated quickly from there. Madison began shouting about her legal authority and my obstruction of justice, her voice climbing to a pitch that was probably audible 3 streets over. She demanded to search my house for evidence of additional violations and threatened to call in federal authorities if I continued to resist her inspection. The woman had completely lost touch with reality. She genuinely seemed to believe that being HOA president gave her law enforcement powers. When I remained in the doorway and calmly repeated that she had no right to enter my home, she began pounding on the doorframe and screaming about how I was destroying the neighborhood and terrorizing innocent families with my sunflowers. That's when I noticed we were attracting an audience. Mrs. Collins from across the street had come out to water her plants but was obviously watching the show while pretending to tend to her garden. Mr. Martinez from next door had stepped onto his porch and was clearly filming the whole thing with his phone while calling for his kids to go inside. Even old Mr. Thompson had emerged from his house 2 doors down and was standing on his lawn with his arms crossed, watching Madison's meltdown with the expression of someone witnessing a public mental health crisis. The woman who claimed to care so much about community standards was making a spectacle of herself that would be talked about for months. Finally, Madison seemed to realize that her shouting match wasn't getting her into my house, and her expression shifted from rage to something much more calculating and dangerous. "Fine," she said, suddenly calm in a way that was somehow more unsettling than her screaming had been. "If you want to do this the hard way, we'll do it the hard way. You've brought this on yourself, Mr. Harper." She walked back to her car with the measured pace of someone who just made a decision, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number while staring directly at me. I could hear her voice from across the yard as she began speaking to whoever had answered. "Yes, I need to report a domestic disturbance and threatening behavior. There's a man at my address who's been harassing me and refuses to comply with lawful inspection orders." From inside my house, I could hear the sirens approaching from several blocks away, growing louder by the second. My heart started pounding as I realized that Madison had actually called 911 and was trying to get me arrested for the crime of not letting her into my house. This was escalation beyond anything I'd prepared for. I was about to be visited by police officers who'd been told I was some kind of domestic threat. I pulled out my phone to call Monica, but before I could dial, I heard her voice coming through Madison's phone conversation. The irony was so perfect it was almost surreal. Madison had called 911 to report me, and my own wife was the dispatcher taking the call. Monica's professional dispatcher voice was calm and measured as she gathered information from Madison, but I could hear the exact moment when she recognized both voices. There was a slight pause. Then Monica continued with her standard protocol questions, giving no indication that she knew either of us personally. "Ma'am, please stay on the line while I dispatch units to your location. Can you confirm that you are currently safe and that the threat is not immediate?" Madison, who was still standing in my driveway, watching me through my front window, assured the dispatcher that she was safe, but that I was escalating the situation and refusing to cooperate with legal authority. Meanwhile, I was standing in my own living room, listening to my wife professionally handle a false police report about me, feeling like I'd fallen into some kind of surreal nightmare. The police cruiser pulled up exactly 6 minutes later. I know because I was watching the clock, trying to figure out how I was going to explain this situation to officers who'd been told I was a threatening domestic disturbance. Madison immediately walked over to meet them, clipboard in hand, ready to present her case about the dangerous sunflower terrorist who lived across the street. But as the officers got out of their car, I noticed something that gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in days. The lead officer was Todd Granger, whom Monica had mentioned as one of the good cops she worked with regularly. If anyone was going to handle this situation fairly, it would be someone who knew and trusted Monica's judgment. Officer Todd Granger approached with the calm professionalism of someone who'd seen every variety of neighborhood dispute imaginable. Madison rushed to meet him before he'd even fully exited his patrol car, clipboard extended like evidence at a murder trial. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she began breathlessly. "This man has been harassing me for weeks, refusing lawful HOA inspections, and when I tried to exercise my authority, he became threatening. I have all the documentation right here." She thrust her laminated papers toward Officer Granger with the fervor of someone reporting a dangerous criminal. But Granger accepted her papers politely, without rushing to judgment, looking toward my house where I stood in the doorway, then back at Madison, clearly assessing the entire situation. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down and tell me exactly what happened today," he said calmly. "But first, let me speak with Mr. Harper." Madison's confident expression faltered. "His version? Officer, I'm the victim here. He's been terrorizing this neighborhood with violations and refusing to respect community authority." But Granger was already walking toward my door, and I noticed his radio crackling with what sounded like very specific dispatcher communication. Monica's voice came through clearly. "Unit 7-3, please confirm if the complainant is still within proximity of the front door. Situation 143 protocols in effect." I didn't know what Situation 143 meant, but Granger's demeanor immediately shifted to something more alert and focused as he glanced back at Madison with obvious reassessment. I explained the entire confrontation clearly: Madison's demand to inspect my house, her escalating threats, and her decision to call police when I wouldn't let her inside. Granger listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at Madison, who was practically vibrating with impatience. When I finished, his radio crackled again. "Unit 7-3, be advised that complainant has extensive history of non-emergency 911 calls, 17 incidents in past 12 months, all resolved as unfounded." Granger's eyebrows rose significantly at this information, and I could see him connecting dots about Madison's credibility and behavioral patterns. That's when Nancy White appeared at the edge of my driveway, looking nervous but determined. She'd clearly been watching from down the street and had finally worked up courage to get involved. "Officer Granger, I'm Nancy White, from the HOA board. I have information relevant to this situation." Madison's face shifted from confident to alarmed. "Nancy, this doesn't concern you," she said quickly. But Nancy was no longer the timid woman who sat silently during board meetings. She walked directly to Granger and pulled a USB drive from her purse. "I've been documenting Madison's harassment of homeowners for months because I was concerned about legal liability," Nancy explained, her voice growing stronger. "She systematically targeted at least 5 families with fake violations and made up fines. Mr. Harper isn't her first victim." Madison tried desperately to regain control as her credibility evaporated in real time. "Nancy, you're completely out of line. I'm the elected president with authority to enforce community standards." But Granger was examining the fake city compliance notice Madison had left on my door, comparing it to an actual city form from his patrol car. "Ma'am, did you create and distribute this document?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even Madison seemed to realize that impersonating city officials wasn't something she could explain away as HOA enforcement. When Granger ran her information and discovered her history of excessive 911 calls, the final pieces fell into place. Abuse of emergency services is a misdemeanor, and filing false police reports is a felony, he told her formally. Today's call appears to fall into both categories. Ms. Fletcher, you're receiving an official warning for abuse of emergency services and filing a false police report, Officer Granger announced. Any future non-emergency calls to 911 will result in criminal charges. I'm also recommending mediation services for neighbor disputes rather than involving law enforcement in civil matters. Madison nodded numbly, clutching her clipboard as she walked back to her car. The woman who'd arrived ready to see me arrested was leaving with an official police warning and the knowledge that her suburban reign of terror was effectively over. Frank appeared from the crowd of onlookers and confirmed he'd witnessed Madison's aggressive behavior, while Mr. Martinez offered his video footage of the entire confrontation. Madison Fletcher, HOA police dictator, had been exposed as what she'd always been, a troubled woman abusing small amounts of power to feel important and in control. The following week brought developments that exceeded my wildest hopes for justice. Nancy White called Tuesday morning with news that made my coffee taste like champagne. Eli, the HOA board held an emergency meeting last night, she said, relief evident in her voice. Madison has been suspended pending investigation, and we're reversing every fine she's issued in the past year. Your $1,200 was just the tip of the iceberg. She collected over $8,000 in illegitimate penalties from families who paid rather than fight her. The investigation revealed Madison's complete abuse of power, including a spreadsheet with detailed profiles of every household and personal assessments of which families were compliant versus problematic. My entry, dated the day I moved in, simply read, "New resident, monitor closely for integration issues." But the real vindication came when Frank called Wednesday afternoon, barely containing his laughter. Eli, check the neighborhood page. Someone posted video of your confrontation with Madison, and it's gone viral. Mr. Martinez's footage showed Madison screaming about sunflowers while pounding on my door, followed by her calculated decision to call 911 when she couldn't get her way. The video reached tens of thousands of views with captions like, "When HOA goes CIA," and the comment section was filled with neighbors sharing their own Madison horror stories and celebrating the end of her tyrannical reign. Several local news outlets picked up the story as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach, making Madison the poster child for everything people hated about power-hungry homeowners associations. The exposure led to systemic changes that would prevent future Madison situations. Nancy White was elected interim president and immediately implemented oversight procedures requiring board approval for significant fines, mandatory mediation before enforcement, and regular audits of member conduct. She established monthly coffee meetings for informal discussion of concerns and created transparent appeals processes for anyone feeling unfairly treated. Frank and Dot Sanders formed a neighborhood watch program focused on preventing HOA abuse rather than looking for criminals, creating resource guides explaining the difference between legitimate community standards and personal vendettas disguised as rule enforcement. Their motto, printed on bright yellow flyers that were definitely a subtle nod to my sunflowers, read, "Community standards, not community harassment." 2 weeks later, just when we thought the saga had finally faded, one last twist bloomed like, well, a sunflower. Madison Fletcher was arrested at home following a formal complaint by the city's legal department. Turns out, impersonating a city compliance officer and issuing fake enforcement notices isn't just a neighborhood faux pas, it's a felony. Someone, not saying it was Frank, but it was definitely Frank, managed to snap a photo of her being led to the patrol car, still clutching her clipboard like it might save her. The picture went viral in the neighborhood group with the caption, "Finally a real citation," with her name on it. Even Monica, who'd handled the original 911 call, couldn't help but smirk when she saw the booking report. "Frequent flyer status revoked," she said with professional satisfaction. That moment sealed the arc, from HOA dictator to cautionary tale, and just like that, Madison left Maple Grove not with a clipboard, but in handcuffs. The personal impact of Madison's downfall rippled through the entire community in ways that went beyond just HOA reform. Families who'd been living in fear of arbitrary fines and harassment began participating in community activities again. Mrs. Patterson finally planted the rose garden she'd been dreaming about for years, and the Johnsons, who'd moved away to escape Madison's tyranny, actually called Nancy to ask about moving back, now that the neighborhood had returned to sanity. Property values, which had reportedly been declining due to Madison's reputation for making life miserable, began recovering as word spread that Maple Grove was once again a place where people could live peacefully without fear of clipboard-wielding dictators showing up at their doors. 6 months later, as I worked in my garden, where my sunflowers had grown to magnificent 4-foot heights attracting butterflies and bees, I noticed a beige minivan pulling up to the house at the end of the street. A woman emerged carrying the familiar clipboard, power walking toward the nearest house with that unmistakable air of someone who'd appointed herself neighborhood quality control manager. She looked to be in her early 30s with blonde highlights, wearing athleisure gear that screamed, "I have opinions about your landscaping choices." I watched her march toward poor Mrs. Patterson's door, clipboard ready, and couldn't help but smile. This time would be different. Frank was already heading over with his Welcome to the Neighborhood packet, which now included detailed explanations of actual HOA rules versus made-up authority, legal aid contact information, and laminated cards with smartphone recording instructions. Dot was emerging with her concerned neighbor bringing cookies expression, really her intelligence-gathering face in disguise. The new would-be dictator had no idea she'd walked into a Madison-proofed community ready for whatever power-hungry nonsense she might try. My sunflowers swayed in the front yard, symbols of successful resistance to petty tyranny, reminding me that sometimes the most important battles are fought over the smallest things. Where are you watching from? Comment below if you think I should worry about this new clipboard-carrying arrival. I'm considering installing a doorbell with laser targeting, but for now, I'm keeping my voice memos app updated and ready for action.